It was late in the evening when Greg, an experienced hiker, decided to venture into the woods. He had heard rumors about strange happenings in the forest, but he dismissed them as superstition, stories meant to scare off those who weren't brave enough to explore. He had no such fear. The forest had always been his second home, its winding paths and towering trees his refuge from the bustle of city life. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a sense of unease that lingered around the edges of his mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Greg found himself deeper into the woods than he had intended. The canopy above thickened, and the path he had been following seemed to disappear into the underbrush. He paused, looking around, trying to get his bearings, but everything felt unfamiliar. The woods, usually so predictable, now seemed to close in around him, as though the trees themselves were watching. Greg shook his head and muttered to himself. "It's just the dark. Nothing to be afraid of." But as he took another step forward, a rustling sound from behind him made his heart race. He spun around, but there was nothing. Just the deepening darkness of the forest. A trick of the wind, he reasoned. But then he heard it again, a faint whisper, barely audible, like a voice calling from just beyond the reach of his sight. The sound came from the direction he had been walking, and Greg hesitated, torn between his instinct to flee and the urge to investigate. He had never been one to shy away from a mystery, and tonight, it felt as if the forest itself was daring him to uncover its secrets. Taking a deep breath, Greg pressed on, his footsteps careful but determined. The whisper grew louder as he moved deeper into the trees, and he began to make out words in the soft murmur. "Come closer," it beckoned. "Come closer." He stopped, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but all he could see were the thick shadows of the trees and the darkening sky above. His breath quickened. This wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the curiosity that had driven him this far now pushed him forward, a need to understand, to know what waited in the darkness. It was then that he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a silhouette against the blackness. But as Greg took a cautious step closer, the shape became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretched and twisted in unnatural ways. Its limbs were long and thin, like the branches of the trees that surrounded it, and its skin appeared to be made of something wrong. Something that didn't belong in the natural world. Greg froze, his blood running cold. He should have run. He should have turned and fled, but something in the creature's presence rooted him to the spot. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, two pale orbs that seemed to pierce through him, seeing things he didn't even know were there. "Do you hear them?" the creature whispered, its voice a soft rasp, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "The whispers of the forest, they've been calling you, haven't they?" Greg's throat went dry. He could barely form a response, his mind spinning, unable to comprehend the impossible sight before him. The creature tilted its head, as though studying him. "You've come far, but you're not like the others," it murmured. "Most of them run. They fear what they cannot see, but you are different. You seek the truth." Greg couldn't speak. His feet felt as though they were cemented to the ground, his breath shallow and quick. He wanted to run, to escape, but the creature's gaze held him captive. The forest itself seemed to be closing in on him, its trees bending and swaying as if alive, listening, waiting. "Do you want to see what lies beyond?" the creature asked, its voice now a melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "What lies hidden in the shadows, where no human dare tread?" Against his better judgment, Greg nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the creature. It seemed to smile, though the expression was more unsettling than comforting. It stepped forward, its long, spindly legs moving with a fluidity that made Greg's skin crawl. "Come," the creature urged, extending a hand toward him. "Come, and I will show you." Something deep within Greg screamed at him to refuse, to run as fast as he could, but another part of him, some dark, buried part of his soul, wanted to follow. The forest, the creature, the whispers, they all promised something, something just out of reach. A truth that had been hidden for centuries. With one last, desperate breath, Greg took a step forward, his hand trembling as he reached out toward the creature. The moment their fingers brushed, the world around him shifted. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, the trees bending and twisting like they were alive, pulling him into some unknown place. He felt weightless, as though he were being pulled through time and space, and for a moment, there was nothing but darkness. When his feet finally hit solid ground again, the world had changed. The forest, the trees, the very air, it was all different. The sky was a sickly shade of green, and the trees were twisted, their bark gnarled and warped. The ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy, as though it were made of moss and decay. Strange creatures scurried through the underbrush, their eyes glowing faintly in the unnatural light. Greg looked around in a daze, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was as though he had stepped into another realm, one where the laws of nature no longer applied. He turned to the creature, who now stood beside him, watching him with those pale, unblinking eyes. "Where are we?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. The creature smiled, its teeth sharp and elongated. "You are where few have ever been," it said softly. "You are in the heart of the forest, where the old ones dwell. The ones who whispered to you." Greg's heart raced. He had heard the stories. Tales of ancient beings that lived in the deep woods, of creatures that preyed on the souls of those who ventured too far. But he had never believed them, never thought they were real. Yet here he was, standing in the midst of it all. The creature extended its long, clawed fingers toward a cluster of trees in the distance, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes. "Come," it beckoned. "There is something you must see." Greg hesitated, but the pull of the creature's presence was too strong. He followed, his feet moving on their own, as though guided by some unseen force. The path ahead seemed to open up, the trees parting to reveal a clearing bathed in a faint, otherworldly light. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, its surface slick with moisture, and around it, hundreds of strange symbols were carved into the ground. As they approached, the creature stopped, its eyes narrowing as it regarded the altar. "This is where the ritual begins," it said, its voice barely a whisper. Greg stepped closer, drawn by an unseen force. He could feel the weight of the altar, the history of it pressing against him like a tangible thing. It was as if the very air around him was alive, humming with ancient energy. "Ritual?" Greg asked, his voice barely audible. "What kind of ritual?" The creature turned its gaze to him, its expression unreadable. "The ritual to awaken the forest," it said. "To bring forth the old ones from their slumber." A cold shiver ran down Greg's spine. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to escape this place, but he couldn't. The forest had him in its grip, and the creature, this thing, held the key to his fate. "The forest has chosen you," the creature murmured. "You will be the one to unlock the door." Greg's mind reeled as the realization hit him. He had been brought here for a reason. The whispers had been calling him, leading him deeper into the woods. But what was he supposed to do now? What choice did he have? "Come," the creature said again, its voice now a command. "You must complete the ritual." With trembling hands, Greg stepped forward, reaching for the symbols on the ground. As his fingers brushed the earth, a low growl echoed through the forest, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. Something stirred in the darkness, something ancient and powerful. The creature's smile widened, its eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You have awakened them," it said softly. "Now, the forest will never be the same." The ground cracked open, and from the depths, shadows began to rise, dark, writhing shapes that seemed to claw their way up from the earth itself. The trees swayed violently, their limbs stretching toward the sky as if to welcome the ancient beings that had been released. Greg felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had opened the door. He had unleashed something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. The shadows that emerged from the ground were not like any creature Greg had ever seen. They were not flesh, but something darker, more sinister, amorphous forms of pure darkness, moving with an unnatural grace, as though they were made of the very night itself. Their eyes, hundreds of them, gleamed with the same pale, eerie light that had shone from the creature's own gaze. As they rose, they seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air around Greg thicken, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. Greg stumbled back, panic clawing at his throat, but the creature beside him held him steady. "You did this," it said softly, its voice almost tender. "You called them, and now they are here." The altar began to glow, the symbols etched into the stone shimmering with a fiery red light. It was as if the ritual had triggered something deep within the earth, something that had been waiting for centuries to be set free. The trees around the clearing seemed to shift, their trunks twisting and contorting into unnatural shapes, as if they too were waking up from a long slumber. Greg's mind raced. He had only come out here to escape the monotony of city life, to clear his head, to reconnect with nature. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The stories he'd heard growing up, the campfire tales about spirits in the woods, about creatures that lived in the dark places, seemed so trivial now. What he was witnessing was real, and it was terrifying. One of the shadowy figures moved toward him, its form expanding and contracting like a cloud of smoke. As it drew closer, Greg could feel the temperature drop. A coldness, so intense it felt like ice running through his veins, swept over him. He instinctively reached for the knife at his belt, but it felt useless, a mere toy against this otherworldly force. His heart hammered in his chest as the shadow loomed over him, its many eyes narrowing in unison, focusing on him. The creature beside him, still watching, still smiling, spoke again. "You are a part of this now, Greg. They are drawn to you. You awakened them, but they will not harm you. Not unless you try to run." Greg didn't know whether to be relieved or horrified by that. He felt his legs weaken, his body trembling with fear. The shadowy entity in front of him reached out, not with hands, but with tendrils of darkness, curling around him like cold, grasping fingers. It touched his skin, and a searing pain shot through his body, as though something was being ripped from inside him. His breath caught in his throat. What is this?" Greg gasped, unable to break free from its grip. The creature beside him whispered again, its voice like a soft lullaby amidst the chaos. "They take what they need from you, Greg. Fear, doubt, pain, they feast on it. But they will leave you if you surrender to them. If you allow the forest to claim you." Greg's pulse raced, and he looked at the creature, then back at the shadow that loomed over him, its eyes now boring into his soul. The forest had him, yes, but so did something worse. He realized now that it wasn't just the forest that had drawn him here. It had been the creature, the one who had appeared at the edge of the trees, who had guided him to this place. "No," Greg whispered, the words scraping painfully from his throat. I can't let them take me. You cannot run from it," the creature interrupted gently, its face close now, inches from his. "You can only accept it." Before Greg could protest, the creature placed a hand on his chest, and with it came a flood of memories, visions of the forest in ancient times, long before the land had been settled by humans, before any living creature walked the earth. He saw towering trees, their roots twisting deep into the soil, feeding off an energy far older than time itself. He saw the shadows that lived within the earth, the ones that had been waiting for their awakening, for the right moment. And he saw the sacrifice of those who had come before him, those who had called upon the forest and paid the price. Greg tried to pull away, but the images were too strong. The memories flooded his mind, and with them, came the realization, he was not the first. Many had come before him, drawn by the whispers of the forest, eager to unlock its secrets, eager to be part of something greater than themselves. They had failed. They had become part of the forest, forever lost to its darkness. But something about Greg, something deep inside him, was different. The creature's whispers, the call of the forest, the shadows that clawed at his very soul, they all had been waiting for him, had been preparing for him to arrive. And now that he had, the forest's thirst for power could finally be quenched. The creature stepped back, and the shadows released their grip on Greg, leaving him gasping for air. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he didn't fall. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and anger. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't let this happen. But deep down, he felt the pull of the forest, the unrelenting call that had drawn him here in the first place. The shadows surrounding him began to shift, coiling around his legs, crawling up his arms. He felt their cold touch again, and this time, it wasn't just pain. It was something worse. It was as if they were seeping into his very being, filling the empty places inside him, consuming him from the inside out. "Fight it," the creature said, its voice low and almost sympathetic. "But know this, Greg, those who fight always lose. The forest claims all who wander too far. It always does." Greg gritted his teeth. He had no choice. There was no escaping this nightmare. He felt the weight of the forest's power pressing down on him, the coldness, the darkness, the ancient energy that had lived for centuries. It wasn't just a forest. It was alive. It was hungry. And it was claiming him. The creature reached forward again, its cold hand resting on Greg's forehead. "It's time to join us," it whispered. Greg closed his eyes, unable to resist anymore. The darkness took him, pulling him into its depths. His mind was swallowed by the forest, his body becoming a part of it, his soul entwined with the ancient spirits that had once roamed the earth freely. He felt himself dissolve, his essence merging with the shadowy tendrils that reached from the earth itself. The last thing he heard, before the world fell completely silent, was the creature's voice, now distant, like an echo in his mind. "You are not lost, Greg. You are home." The forest had claimed him. Just as it had claimed the others before him. Just as it would claim anyone foolish enough to listen to its whispers. But now, Greg understood. He was no longer an outsider. He had become one with the darkness, part of the ancient, eternal hunger that had always lurked just beyond the edge of the world. And the forest would never let him go. The world around Greg dissolved into a blur of shadows, his body no longer feeling like his own. It was as if the forest itself had pulled him into a different state of existence, a place where time had no meaning, where space was endless, and where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred into one. In the darkness, he could feel the presence of others, lost souls like him, who had wandered too deep into the forest and never returned. He could hear their whispers, their murmurs of regret, as they drifted through the eternal night. Some of them were human, their voices familiar, carrying the same sense of confusion and fear that had once echoed in Greg's own heart. But others were not. They were ancient beings, creatures that had existed long before humanity, their voices like the rustle of leaves in an endless storm, like the murmurs of forgotten gods. Greg tried to move, to speak, but he found that he could not. His limbs felt as though they had turned to stone, his mouth clamped shut by an invisible force. He was no longer in control of his body, no longer in control of his own thoughts. The forest had taken everything from him, the man he had been, the thoughts he once had, the world he had known. Now, all that was left was the forest. All that was left was the hunger. Then, he felt it, a presence, familiar yet terrifying. It was the creature, the one that had led him here, the one who had whispered in his ear and guided him into the embrace of the forest. Greg's mind screamed in protest, but there was no voice left to cry out. The creature stepped into view, its towering form emerging from the swirling shadows like a ghost in the night. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto Greg. It smiled, and though its lips never moved, Greg could feel the malicious joy radiating from it, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. You are one of us now, the creature said, its voice echoing in the darkness. But you will learn, you will understand, what it truly means to belong. Greg could feel his consciousness slipping away, drowning in the vastness of the forest, but some part of him, some small, desperate part, fought to hold on to the remnants of his humanity. He tried to resist, tried to cling to the memory of who he had been, but it was slipping from him, like sand through his fingers. Don't fight it, the creature whispered, its voice a low, soothing hum. You will find peace here. You will never be alone again. And for a moment, it felt true. The hunger, the emptiness that had gnawed at him in the real world, it was gone. Here, in the forest, there was no need for food, no need for sleep, no need for anything. All of those things, all of the human desires, seemed meaningless in the face of the vast, eternal power of the forest. The creature's eyes gleamed with knowing as it moved closer to him. You're no longer the man who came here, it said softly. You are something greater now. You are part of the forest's heart, part of the hunger that has slumbered for centuries. Greg tried to fight it again, but there was no escaping. The forest's power was too strong. Slowly, painfully, he began to lose his sense of self. His memories of the outside world, of the life he had once lived, began to fade, replaced by the whispers of the shadows, by the sensations of the ancient trees, by the terrible, endless hunger that pulsed through every fiber of his being. He could feel it now. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, an all-encompassing force that reached into the very depths of his soul, devouring everything that made him human. The creature's whispers became a steady hum, blending with the forest's voice, until Greg's thoughts were no longer his own. You are one with us, the creature repeated. You are no longer a stranger in these woods. You are the forest. Greg's body trembled as the transformation began to take hold. His limbs lengthened, his skin darkened, his form contorting in unnatural ways. It wasn't painful, it was more like shedding an old skin, a skin that had never truly belonged to him. The forest's power coursed through his veins, filling him with a sense of vastness, of eternity. His human body, his human mind, were fading into something far older, far more primal. And then, just as it seemed that Greg would be consumed entirely, something within him snapped. A flash of memory, a spark of clarity, flashed through his mind like a distant star in the void. He remembered his family. He remembered the quiet days he had spent with friends, the moments of laughter and joy. He remembered his purpose, the reason he had come to the forest in the first place, to escape, yes, but also to find himself. To feel alive again. For a fleeting moment, Greg's mind reached out, desperate to reclaim the person he had once been. But it was too late. The forest had already claimed him. He had become a part of it, a part of the darkness that had been waiting in the shadows. He was not Greg anymore. He was something else, something that had no name, no identity. He was the forest's hunger, its shadow, its eternal servant. And still, the creature watched him, its glowing eyes gleaming with satisfaction. You'll understand soon enough, it said, its voice soft and final. You'll see that there is no escape from this place. No escape from the forest. Greg's mind screamed in horror, but there was no voice to make a sound. The transformation was complete. But then, something changed. Deep in the distance, beyond the reach of the twisted trees, Greg thought he heard something, a faint sound, like a cry, like a call for help. It was soft at first, just a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, more desperate. Someone else had come into the forest. Someone else had fallen victim to the whispers, just as Greg had. The creature turned its attention toward the sound, its eyes narrowing in recognition. It smiled, its teeth sharp and cruel. Another one, it murmured. Another soul for the forest. And Greg, now something else entirely, felt the hunger rise once again. It wasn't just a part of the forest. It wasn't just an ancient power. It was him now, and the whispers that had once haunted him now lived in his own mind. The cycle would continue. The forest would claim all who wandered too far, all who answered its call. No one would escape. And as Greg, no longer Greg, but something far worse, moved deeper into the shadows of the forest, he knew that the forest would never stop calling, never stop claiming. It had claimed him, and now, it would claim them all. One by one. Greg moved through the shadows, drawn by the faint, desperate cries that echoed through the trees. The hunger within him stirred, relentless, as it always did, urging him to claim another soul, to feed the forest's insatiable appetite. The creature watched, its smile growing ever wider. Another one, it whispered, savoring the moment. But as Greg moved closer, something shifted. The cry, once distant, was now unmistakable, urgent, familiar. It wasn't just any voice. It was someone he knew. Someone from his past. His breath caught. The hunger faltered. The whispers in his mind grew distant for a moment, swallowed by a memory, a face, something human, something that should have been lost long ago. The figure stepped out from the shadows. Greg froze. For a brief moment, the forest held its breath. And then, the figure turned towards him, their eyes locking in the darkness. The forest waited. But this time, the hunger wasn't the only thing that had been awakened.